Today I'm standing in front of the Pencil Factory Flats. It's a 5/1 apartment building. It's got a comedy bar, breakfast bar, corner store. It's normal. I never really thought about it after 100 times driving past it. But I was talking to a friend who lived here, and she said when she lived here she felt disturbing energy. Kind of like somebody had died here, or had been murdered. Now I'm a skeptic, and I said, of course, it's not haunted. But she said, Google it. And of course, when you do, you get a lot of results. Today on WTATL, 100-year-old cold case, urban redevelopment, and why things aren't always what they seem.
In 1913, 3 people changed the perception of Jews in the South and the perception of the South in the national discussion. Leo Frank, a young Jewish man from Brooklyn, was working at his uncle's business, the National Pencil Company, in Atlanta. In April of that year, one of his employees, Mary Fagan from Marietta, was found dead, strangled to death, inside the factory. Frank was the last person to see her alive. Because of this, the police, who didn't have any clear leads, made Frank their prime suspect. Jim Conley, the groundsman, was suspected when he was seen washing a bloody shirt, but eventually public opinion led to Frank being fingered for the crime. He was sentenced to death, but the governor, John Slayton, commuted his sentence to life in prison out of a crisis of conscience. However, just a few months later, a mob kidnapped Frank, took him to Marietta, and hung him from a tree. This is a crazy story. It's the subject of several different books, and it has wide-ranging effects. Frank was the president of his local B'nai B'rith organization, and the group saw some really bad things with his case, especially the fact that he wasn't present when he was sentenced to death, and they eventually founded the Anti-Defamation League from their experience. The event was seen to be a catalyst of anti-Semitism in the South as well, but it's also the South's first big city crime. You can read pages and pages of salacious material about Frank's supposed perversions and the grisly crime scene all throughout the newspapers of the time.
This is also a case where we still don't know the details even 100 years later. In my research, I found the logo for the National Pencil Company, and it turns out their factory was on Forsyth Street, which is like half a mile away. So why did my friend think that the pencil factory murder happened here? Well, obviously because it's called the Pencil Factory, but why is this called the Pencil Factory?
The Ford factory lofts were at one time a Ford factory, and the gasket lofts were a gasket warehouse. It's painted on the side of the building. But this is not where that pencil factory stood.
All right, so fast forward to a couple days later, and I have been researching this like crazy, and I'm at the end of my rope. This thing is really aggravating because I'm so close. I've basically been able to find some aerial photographs of the area from the 1940s, and I don't know, take a look for yourself. They're not really convincing as a pencil factory. They look more like a junkyard to me. But I'm still not sure. There's no labels on these photographs. I haven't been able to find any sort of records of a pencil factory in business directories. So I turn to the one person who can help me, a librarian, specifically the librarian of urban studies at Georgia State University. And she was able to find a great resource for me that I'm probably going to start checking out in my free time because they're that awesome. They're called Sanborn maps. And basically, Sanborn maps are kind of like the Phoenix, Atlanta's mascot, in that both were born out of fire. Fire was a really, really common occurrence in the 1800s and 1900s in almost every city. You had a lot of buildings that were made out of wood, no sprinkler systems, the fire extinguisher hadn't even been invented yet. So a fire was going to happen a couple times a year in a big city. I'm actually going to try and do a video on Atlanta's hotel fires because there were just so many of them. So basically, insurance doesn't really work that well if you don't have a fair assessment value for what's being insured. And that works for individual properties, but also for like whole cities. And so Sanborn came in, the Sanborn company, and basically said, we're going to fix that. We're going to find an insurance value for whole cities, blocks, neighborhoods, everything. And they basically, from like the end of the 1800s up to the 1970s, like every 5 or 10 years, would map out every city in America, block by block, property by property, and every house was modeled. And if it was a business, it would have who owned the business, what it was called, what they made, what the building was made out of, any sort of outbuildings, outhouses, storage rooms, everything. Everything you could ever want. And once I found these, the process was pretty simple. You just take a look at the big map, find the square that corresponds to the sort of detail map that you're trying to find, go to that number and take a look. And, drum roll please, you'll be very excited to find out, that spot was actually another pencil factory. So I was so caught up in the murder and the salaciousness and the aggravation of why would they name this building the pencil factory when the pencil factory was a mile away, that I hadn't even stopped to think that maybe there were two pencil factories in the same city. It can happen. So this pencil factory is actually called the M.H. First Pencil Factory at the RST. It was founded by a guy named Moni First in the 20s. It eventually got renamed to Scripto, sold pencils through World War II, became the biggest pencil company in the world for a time, and then the name just kind of got traded around by a bunch of Japanese corporations, and right now you can find Scripto on dollar store lighters. So actually this story kind of has the same sort of connection with names and meaning being passed around and ambiguity. I think it's actually a really interesting connection to find Scripto as the pencil factory that coined the pencil factory lofts. That's it for this video. Make sure to like and subscribe, share this with your Atlanta history friends if that's a thing, and come back next time for a new story in the history of Atlanta on What the ATL.